You stood at the door with your coat already on, keys warm in your fist, and you did not leave. Not that night. Not the night after. Something kept pulling you back toward a room you had already decided to walk out of, and in all the mornings since, you have never once asked yourself why the leaving felt harder than the staying it was supposed to replace. This is not only about doors. It is about the job you keep telling people you are about to quit. The love you keep calling patience when it has become something closer to fear. The version of yourself you have outgrown the way a coat is outgrown, sleeves too short now, seams pulling at the shoulders, and still you wear it every day because taking it off would mean admitting how long you have been cold inside it. You have mistaken holding on for loving. You have mistaken staying for loyalty. And somewhere underneath the mistake, a part of you has known the truth for longer than you have been willing to say it out loud. What follows will not ask you to let go of anything. Letting go is a word people use when they have never actually done it. A soft word for a hard thing. And softness has never once loosened a closed hand. What follows is something quieter and more exact. It is the slow, unglamorous work of learning the difference between the hand that holds because it is afraid, and the hand that opens because it finally understands what it was holding was never a possession in the first place. Here is the part no one tells you. The moment you have been dreading, the moment of the actual leaving, was never the danger. The danger was always what came after, in the empty room, in the silence where the old grip used to be. Because a hand that has held too tightly for too long does not know what to do once it is finally open. That question, what an open hand is for, is the one this journey will not let you look away from. Based on the book The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Coat You Never Took Off. The first sign of change is small enough to ignore. You notice it in the smallest moments, the ones no one else sees. You are standing in your kitchen at 11 at night, and the dishes are done, and the house is quiet. And there is nothing left to distract you from the fact that you are still standing there, not sitting, not resting, standing, the way a person stands when some part of them is still deciding whether to run. You do not know what you are waiting for. You have not known for a while now, but your body has started keeping its own counsel, and lately your body has been telling you something your mind refuses to hear. This is where it starts, not with a crisis, not with a single dramatic morning where everything falls apart at once. It starts smaller than that, quieter than that. In the accumulation of moments where you catch yourself gripping something that stopped fitting you a long time ago. A job you took for reasons that made sense 5 years ago, and now cannot fully explain. A friendship that runs on habit more than warmth. A version of who you are that you built to survive a season of your life that has already ended, and that you have kept wearing because you never noticed the season change. You tell yourself you are being responsible, practical. You tell yourself that holding steady is a virtue, and in many rooms of your life it is. But there is a difference between the steadiness of a person standing on solid ground and the rigidity of a person clenched around something they are afraid to lose, and you have started to suspect, somewhere in the part of you that does not lie, that you have not been standing. You have been clenching. Here is a question worth sitting with, uncomfortable as it is. What is the difference between commitment and fear dressed as commitment? Commitment moves towards something. It has a direction, a reason, a future it is building. Fear dressed as commitment only moves away from the discomfort of change. It does not ask where it is going. It only asks how to avoid what it might lose. You can commit to a marriage because you are building a life together. Or you can commit to it because the alternative, the unknown terror of being alone with yourself, feels worse than a slow erosion you have learned to call peace. From the outside, these two things can look identical. From the inside, one of them is quietly killing you. You know this feeling. The evening drive home when you take the longer route for no reason you could explain if someone asked. The way you check your phone for a message that is not coming. Not because you want to hear from that person specifically, but because the checking gives your hands something to do besides feel the empty room around you. The way you have started rehearsing conversations you have no intention of having, imagining what you would say if you finally told the truth, and then closing the imagining like a drawer, because it is easier to imagine the truth than to live inside it. There is an old teaching about a man who stood before a crowd that loved him, and told them, before he could go, before I can leave this shore, that he had to remember something. Not learn it fresh, not invent it. Remember it. As though the truth he needed had been in him the whole time, buried under 12 years of belonging to people who needed him to stay exactly as he was. That is the shape of what is happening to you now, whether you have named it yet or not. You are not looking for something new. You are trying to remember something you knew before you learned to make yourself smaller, for the sake of people and habits and identities that stopped asking who you actually were. Notice how your chest tightens when you imagine actually changing something. Not the fantasy version, the pleasant daydream where everything resolves itself gracefully. The real version. The conversation where you say the thing you have been avoiding. The morning you wake up and do not go back to the job. The night you finally stop waiting for someone to become who you need them to be. Your chest tightens because some old, animal part of you has confused safety with stillness, and it is screaming that stillness is the only thing standing between you and disaster. But stillness has never actually kept you safe. It has only kept you familiar. And you have started in these small kitchen at midnight moments to feel the difference between the two. Familiar is not the same as safe. Familiar is just the shape your fear has learned to wear so well that you stopped recognizing it as fear at all. Think about the coat again, the one with the 2 short sleeves. You do not keep wearing it because you believe it fits. You keep wearing it because taking it off means standing in the cold for a moment before you find something new. And that moment, that bare, exposed, uncertain moment, is the one thing you have organized your entire life to avoid. So you keep the coat on. You keep the job. You keep the relationship exactly as it is. You keep the version of yourself that everyone already knows how to love. Because the unknown version, the one still waiting underneath, has never once been given the room to prove it could survive out in the open. This is not a failure of character. No one warned you that the things you build to protect yourself in one season can become the very things that cage you in the next. You built walls when you needed walls. You built routines when you needed routines. You built a self that could be depended on, because somewhere along the way, being depended on felt like the closest thing to being loved that you could reliably get. None of that was wrong. It kept you standing through things that could have broken you. But a wall built for a storm that has already passed is no longer protection. It is just a wall, standing in the sun, blocking a view you have not let yourself see in years. There is a difference worth drawing here between comfort and safety, 2 words that get used as though they mean the same thing when they do not. Comfort is the absence of friction. Safety is the presence of solid ground. A room can be comfortable and still be dangerous, the way a familiar argument can feel easier than a new conversation, simply because you already know its shape. And a room can be uncomfortable, even frightening at first, and still be the safest place you have stood in years, because for the first time the ground under your feet is real instead of arranged. You have been choosing comfort and calling it safety for so long that the 2 words have started to feel interchangeable in your mouth. They are not. One of them is keeping you warm. The other one is the only thing that will actually hold your weight. You are allowed to ask what is on the other side of it. Not yet to open the door, just to ask. Standing in your kitchen at 11 at night, dishes done, house quiet, body still deciding whether to run, you are allowed to admit, just to yourself, just this once, that some part of you has been asking that question for longer than you have let yourself hear it. The coat is still on. You have not taken it off tonight. But you noticed it tonight. Really noticed the weight of it on your shoulders for the first time in longer than you can count. And noticing is not nothing. Noticing is the first door opening in a house you thought had no more doors left. Chapter 2. The Lie That Keeps the Lights On. You already know. You have always known. You know before you know. You have always known before you know. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a person who has gotten very good at not looking at something. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a room with the television left on for company, sound filling the space so the quiet underneath never has a chance to speak. You have that kind of silence in you right now, and you have had it for longer than you are ready to admit. And the strange, almost unbearable truth is this. You already know what it is hiding. You have known the whole time. This is the part that gets skipped over in every conversation about change, because it is the least flattering part. People like to imagine that awareness arrives like weather, a storm that catches you off guard, blameless, sudden. But that is rarely how it happens. More often, awareness has been standing at the door for years, knocking politely, and you have been the one turning up the volume so you would not have to hear it. Not because you are weak, because your mind is doing exactly what minds are built to do. It is protecting you from a truth it has judged, rightly or wrongly, to be more dangerous than the discomfort of not knowing. Consider the shape this takes in your own life. The friend who has hurt you the same way 4 times, and each time you find a new explanation that is not about them. The number on the scale, the number in the account, the number of months since you last had an honest conversation with the person across the table from you at dinner, numbers you have trained your eyes to slide past the way you slide past a stranger's face on the street. None of this is stupidity. It is architecture. You built it, plank by plank, because at some point, not seeing was the only way to keep functioning. Here is a distinction worth holding carefully. Because the two are so often confused, they might as well be twins. Ignorance is not knowing. Denial is knowing, and building an entire structure of daily life around not looking at what you know. Ignorance is innocent. Denial is a form of labor. It takes energy to not see something that is standing in the middle of the room. It takes constant, exhausting maintenance, the mental equivalent of rearranging furniture around a hole in the floor so no one, including yourself, will trip into it by accident. You have been doing this labor for a long time. You have gotten so skilled at it that it no longer feels like effort. It feels like personality. You call yourself easygoing when what you mean is that you have stopped registering the things that would upset you if you let them fully land. You call yourself patient when what you mean is that some part of you has calculated correctly that patience is cheaper than confrontation. You call yourself busy, and busy has become the most respectable form of not looking that modern life has ever invented, because a person in motion never has to sit still long enough to feel what is underneath the motion. There is an old teaching about a man who, when the people asked him to speak of reason and passion, told them these were not enemies, but 2 guests in the same house, and that the danger was never one overpowering the other. The danger was the house falling into disrepair, while the 2 of them quarreled, each certain the other was to blame. This is close to what is happening inside you now. Your knowing and your not wanting to know are not opposites, locked in a war you must referee. They are 2 forces sharing the same house, and the house itself, your actual life, your actual days, has been quietly falling into disrepair while you let the argument between them run on without end. Ask yourself honestly, not performing the honesty for anyone watching, just for the version of you standing alone in this moment. What is the thing you already know, not suspect, know? The thing you would say out loud in the first 5 seconds if someone you trusted completely asked you, right now, no consequences,
What is actually true? You felt something move in your chest just reading that sentence. That movement is not new information arriving. That is old information, finally given permission to surface. Denial does not announce itself as denial. That is the trick of it. And it is a good trick, refined over a lifetime. It announces itself as reasonableness, as give it more time, as they didn't mean it that way, as I'm probably overreacting. Each of these sentences might on any given day be true. That is what makes the pattern so difficult to catch. A denial built entirely of lies would collapse under its own weight within a week. A denial built from sentences that are each individually reasonable, stacked one on top of another until they form a wall tall enough to hide an entire truth behind it, can stand for years. Yours has. Notice what happens in your body when you consider dropping just one plank from that wall. Not the whole structure. One plank. The tightness that rises in your throat is not a warning that something is wrong with you. It is a signal that something in you is finally being asked to move after a long stillness, and movement after stillness always aches before it steadies. You have not been foolish. You have been surviving a truth you did not yet have the resources to hold, and building a life around not holding it was, for a while, the most intelligent thing available to you. But resources change. People change. The version of you standing here now reading this is not the same version who first built that wall, and there is a real question worth asking quietly, without demanding an answer tonight. What would happen if the wall were no longer necessary? Not gone, just no longer necessary, the way a cast comes off a bone that has finally, actually healed. Consider what the wall has actually cost you to maintain, separate from what it protects you from. A wall requires constant upkeep. It requires you to redirect conversations before they reach certain rooms, to change the subject with a skill so practiced it no longer even registers as effort, to keep a low, steady vigilance running in the background of nearly every interaction that might wander too close to the thing you have decided not to see. That vigilance is not free. It is the reason you are more tired at the end of an ordinary day than the day's actual events would explain. Part of you has been standing guard this entire time, and a guard, even a good one, never fully rests. You do not have to answer that tonight. You do not have to remove a single plank before you close your eyes. But something in you heard the question, and it did not turn away this time, and that more than any dramatic confession, more than any single moment of clarity, is how a wall this old actually starts to come down. Not all at once. One quiet refusal to look away, followed by another, until the looking becomes a habit stronger than the not looking ever was. The lights are still on in that room in you. The television is still playing. But for the first time in longer than you can remember, you heard something underneath the noise tonight, and you did not immediately reach for the volume. Chapter 3. The Word You Never Had. Giving a name to what you never dared to see. Some truths do not need to be discovered. They need to be named. There is a particular relief that comes from hearing someone else describe in exact words a feeling you have carried your entire life without ever finding language for it. It is not the relief of learning something new. It is closer to the relief of being found. You have felt this before, somewhere in a conversation or a passage in a book or a stranger's offhand comment that landed with more weight than the stranger could have known. A moment where you thought quietly, "That is it. That is the thing I have never been able to say." This chapter is going to ask you to sit inside that kind of moment on purpose. Here is the pattern. For most of your life, you have been giving to people, to work, to obligations, in a way that looks from the outside like generosity, and that has, in fact, often been generosity. But underneath the giving, there is a second motion running quietly alongside it, one you have never quite let yourself examine. You give, and some part of you is keeping score. Not consciously, not in a way you would ever say out loud,
because saying it out loud would make you sound like the kind of person you have worked hard your whole life not to be. But the score is there, and when the giving is not returned in a shape you recognize, something in you goes cold in a way that surprises even you. You have called this many things over the years: sensitivity, being taken for granted, having high standards for how people should treat one another. All of these names are partial truths, and partial truths are the most convincing kind, because they are true enough to feel complete while leaving out the one detail that would change everything. The detail is this: you have not simply been giving, you have been investing and expecting a return, while telling yourself and everyone around you that the giving was unconditional. This is not a moral failing. It is a survival strategy learned early, likely learned before you had the words to know you were learning it. Somewhere in your history, being useful, being generous, being the one who gives without being asked, became the safest way to secure love in a world where love did not always arrive freely. A child does not reason this out. A child simply notices what earns warmth and repeats it. And the pattern hardens into something that no longer feels like strategy at all. By the time you are an adult, it feels like your personality. It feels like who you are. It has been so long since it was a choice that you no longer remember it was ever anything else. There is an old teaching that speaks of love that possesses and love that only gives, and says the second is the only kind worth calling love at all. Love that does not flow through the narrow gorge of one heart into another, but through an open field, freely without ledger. It is easy to hear a teaching like that and nod,
and quietly file it away as a beautiful idea meant for people wiser or calmer than you. But notice, right now, the specific place in your body that tightened slightly when you read the word ledger. That tightening is information. It is the sound of the pattern being seen, perhaps for the first time in your adult life, by the one person whose seeing actually matters, which is you. Here is a distinction that will change how you understand every relationship you have ever had, if you let it land fully. Generosity and appeasement look identical from the outside, and feel entirely different from the inside. Generosity moves toward another person because their well-being genuinely matters to you, and it remains steady whether or not anything comes back. Appeasement moves toward another person to manage your own fear, the fear of conflict, the fear of disappointing them, the fear of the withdrawal of love. And it is never actually free because underneath it is always a transaction, however well disguised. You have called your appeasement generosity for years because the alternative, naming it accurately, would have meant admitting how much of your giving has actually been fear wearing a kind costume. This is the moment where most people flinch and look away, because naming a pattern this precisely can feel like an accusation. It is not an accusation. It is closer to a diagnosis, and a diagnosis, however uncomfortable, is the only thing that makes treatment possible. You cannot dissolve a pattern you refuse to name. You can only keep living inside it, mistaking its walls for the shape of the world itself. Think of a specific moment. Not a general sense of the pattern, but one exact memory. The time you stayed late to help someone who never once asked how your week had gone. The time you agreed to something you did not want, and smiled while agreeing, and felt something curdle quietly in your stomach that you told yourself was nothing. That curdling was the ledger updating itself. That smile was appeasement, doing its ancient, exhausting work. You are not being asked to stop giving. Giving, real giving, unconditioned giving, is one of the few things in this life that actually feels like being fully alive. You are being asked to separate it, carefully, from its imposter. To notice, in the moment before you say yes to something, whether the yes is coming from abundance or from fear. This is not a skill you will master in a day. It took you decades to build the pattern this deeply into your instincts, and it will take real time to build a new instinct beside it, one that can eventually replace it. But the first step, the only step available to you tonight,
is simply naming what has been running the show.
You might be asking somewhere underneath this whether naming the pattern means you have to stop trusting your own generosity altogether, treating every kind impulse from now on as a suspect, interrogating each instinct to give before you allow yourself to act on it. That is not what this chapter is asking of you, and it would be its own kind of exhausting trap if it were. The goal is not constant self-suspicion. The goal is a single, honest checkpoint, placed only at the moments that matter most, the moments where a yes is about to cost you something real. Most of your giving, on most ordinary days, needs no interrogation at all. It is only at the edges, in the moments where resentment tends to gather afterwards, that the checkpoint earns its keep. You have a word now for something you have felt your entire life without being able to say it. That word will not fix anything by itself. Naming a river does not change its current. But it does mean that the next time you feel that particular cold thing rise in your chest when your giving goes unreturned, you will know exactly what is happening inside you. And knowing exactly what is happening is the difference between being swept downstream and finally, for the first time, standing on the bank. You are still standing in the current tonight, but you are standing there with your eyes open now, and that alone is a different kind of standing than the one you have known your whole life. Chapter 4. The Machine Underneath the Kindness. Understanding the machine, without shame. Every pattern that survives this long survives because it works. That is the part no one tells you. You have spent the last 2 chapters looking at something you would rather not have seen this clearly. The wall, the ledger, the giving that was never quite free. It would be easy now to move straight into judgment, to decide that what you have found is evidence of some flaw in your character, proof that you are, underneath the version of yourself people love, something colder and more calculating than you want to be. Resist that. What you are about to look at is not a flaw. It is a machine, built with real engineering, and machines do not deserve shame. They deserve to be understood. Here is the mechanism, laid open piece by piece without judgment. At the center of it is a single quiet belief, one you have likely never said aloud because saying it aloud would sound absurd, even to you. The belief is this: love is not simply given to you. Love is something you must earn continuously through effort. And the moment the effort stops, the love will stop too. You did not choose this belief the way you choose a coat or a career. It was installed in you early by circumstances you likely could not name even if pressed. A parent whose warmth came and went unpredictably. A household where affection was a reward rather than a foundation. A childhood where being easy, being helpful, being no trouble at all, was the surest way to keep the peace. The belief made sense then. It was, in fact, an accurate reading of the world you were living in as a child. The tragedy is not that you formed the belief. The tragedy is that the world changed, and the belief did not. Once that belief is in place, the rest of the machine builds itself automatically, the way a single crack in a windshield spreads into a web overnight. If love must be earned, then withdrawing effort feels, at the level of the nervous system, indistinguishable from withdrawing from danger itself. This is why the thought of saying no to someone you love can produce a physical response, a tightening in the chest, a flush of heat, a sudden urgent need to soften whatever you were about to say. Your body is not overreacting. Your body is responding with total logic to a threat it has been trained since childhood to take seriously. The machine is not broken. The machine is working exactly as designed. This is the part worth sitting with the longest, because it reframes everything. You have not failed to protect yourself all these years. You have succeeded brilliantly at protecting a version of yourself that no longer exists in quite the same danger it once did. The child who needed to earn love to survive an unpredictable home built a magnificent system for doing exactly that. The adult standing in your kitchen tonight is not in that home anymore.
But the system does not know this. Systems built under threat do not update themselves automatically once the threat has passed. They keep running the original program faithfully, indefinitely, unless something intervenes to teach them the danger is over. There is an old teaching that speaks of the self as a sea, boundless, and says that within it lives both the tide that rises and the tide that falls, and that neither should be mistaken for the whole ocean. This is close to what is happening inside the machine you are examining. The fear that drives your appeasement is a tide. It rises predictably, in response to predictable triggers, someone's disappointment, someone's silence, the possibility of being seen as difficult. But the tide is not the ocean. It is not the whole of who you are. It is one current, powerful and old, moving through a much larger body of water that contains far more than fear alone. Look now at the specific triggers that set the machine in motion, because they are more precise than you have probably ever let yourself notice. It is not disagreement in general that frightens you. It is a very particular flavor of disagreement, the kind that comes with even a hint of coldness. A pause a half-second too long, a tone that drops a fraction of a degree. Your machine was not built to fear conflict itself. It was built to fear a specific temperature change, the one that, in your childhood home, reliably preceded withdrawal. You have been reacting to that exact temperature ever since, in rooms and relationships that have nothing to do with where the fear was built, responding to a signal that once meant real danger, and now, most of the time, means nothing at all. Here is a distinction that will matter more than almost anything else in this chapter. There is a difference between a reflex and a choice, even when they produce the exact same behavior. A reflex fires before thought has any chance to intervene, the hand pulling back from heat before the mind has registered pain. A choice, even a fast one, has a sliver of space in it, a gap between the trigger and the response, however small, where something other than pure fear gets a vote. Right now, your appeasement operates almost entirely as reflex. The work ahead of you, and it is real work, is not to eliminate the fear. Fear this old does not simply vanish because you have understood its origin. The work is to widen that sliver of space, the gap between the temperature drop and your automatic softening, until there is enough room in it for a different response to occasionally win. You will not do this by force. Forcing a reflex to stop only teaches the nervous system that the threat is even bigger than it thought, because now even the reliable coping mechanism is being denied. You will do it the way any pattern this old is actually changed, slowly, through repeated small moments where you notice the gap opening, and just once, let something other than fear step into it. A pause before you say yes. A single sentence left unsoftened. A silence you do not rush to fill. None of these will feel like triumphs in the moment. They will feel, if anything, unbearably risky, because the machine will register each one as a small departure from the program that kept you safe for decades. This is not a flaw in you that needs to be eliminated. It is a system that protected a child who had no other options, and that system has earned, at minimum, your understanding before it earns your intervention. You are not tearing the machine out. You are slowly teaching it that the world it was built for is not the world you are standing in now. Tonight, you understand the mechanism in a way you did not this morning. That understanding will not stop the next tide from rising, but the next time you feel that particular temperature drop, that half-second pause that makes your chest tighten, and your mouth starts softening a truth you meant to say plainly, you will recognize it not as who you are, but as a program running, one you are, slowly, patiently, beginning to rewrite. Chapter 5. The Bill You Never Saw Coming. The price no one told you to expect. Every system has a cost. The machine you understood in the last chapter has been running for years, and it has never once been free. There is a kind of arithmetic that never appears on paper and never shows up in a bank statement or a calendar, and yet it has been accumulating in the background of your life For as long as the machine has been running, you have not seen the bill because it has never arrived all at once, the way debt usually announces itself. It has arrived in installments so small, you barely registered each one, a minute here, a piece of yourself there, until the total sum became large enough to change the shape of your entire life without you ever signing anything, without you ever agreeing to the terms out loud. Start with the smallest installment, the one that seems too minor to matter. Every time you have softened a truth to keep the temperature in a room from dropping, you have paid with a small piece of your own voice. Not the physical voice. The other one, the internal certainty that what you think and feel is worth saying plainly, without cushioning, without apology. That certainty does not disappear all at once when you betray it. It erodes, the way a coastline erodes imperceptibly, year after year, until one day you look at the map of who you used to be and find that entire sections of shoreline that were once solid ground have simply vanished into the water. You know this erosion. You have felt it in rooms where you had a clear opinion and heard yourself, almost against your own will, offering something vaguer instead, something that could not be argued with because it did not actually say anything. You told yourself this was diplomacy. Some of it was. But diplomacy chosen freely and diplomacy performed out of fear feel different in the body, even when they sound identical from the outside. And you have known, somewhere underneath the performance, which one you were actually doing. Here is a cost that is harder to name, because it does not feel like loss in the moment it happens. It feels, if anything, like safety. Every time the machine has succeeded, every time your appeasement has kept a relationship from the conflict you feared, you have received a small hit of relief. And relief, repeated often enough, starts to feel like reward. This is the part that makes the pattern so difficult to see from inside it. The cost and the reward are not separate events happening at different times. They are the same event. The very thing draining you is also, simultaneously, the thing your nervous system experiences as success. You are not simply losing something each time the machine runs. You are being trained, session after session, to want to keep losing it, because losing it feels, in the moment, like winning. There is an old teaching about work, about how a man might toil not for love but for gain, and be no better than one who works for nothing, while his heart secretly resents every hour of it, hollow inside its own motion. This is close to the deeper cost, the one underneath the erosion of your voice. It is possible to spend years fully occupied, fully engaged, apparently thriving, while a hollowness grows quietly beneath all of it because the activity, however impressive from the outside, was never actually chosen from a place of wholeness. It was chosen from the machine, from the old belief that effort is the price of love, and effort performed to avoid a threat, however skillfully performed, never actually fills the place inside you that real, freely given effort would have filled instead. Look now at what this has cost you in the relationships that matter most. Not the surface relationships, the acquaintances and colleagues where a little appeasement is simply the ordinary lubricant of getting along in the world. The close ones, the ones where real intimacy was supposed to live. Intimacy requires two full people, each willing to be fully seen, including the parts that might disappoint. But the machine has spent years training you to hide precisely those parts, the disagreements, the needs, the moments of anger or want that might cause the temperature to drop. What remains, in the relationships that matter most, is not intimacy. It is a very well-managed performance of intimacy, convincing enough that even you, most days, cannot tell the difference. The people who love you have been loving a version of you edited for their comfort. And some part of you has always known that the edited version is not quite the whole truth. And that knowledge, sitting quietly under every close relationship you have, is its own particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being loved for a performance instead of a self. This is the cost that arrives latest and lands hardest. Not exhaustion, though exhaustion is real. Not resentment,
though resentment has been building in rooms you have not let yourself walk into. The final cost is the quiet growing suspicion that if you ever did stop performing, if you ever showed the full, unedited version of yourself, the love currently directed at you might not survive contact with the truth. This suspicion is rarely tested, because testing it feels too dangerous. And so it sits, unexamined for years, quietly convincing you that the performance is not a choice anymore but a necessity, that the mask has become load-bearing, holding up a structure that would collapse without it. Here is the honest reckoning this chapter asks you to make, without flinching and without spiraling into despair, because despair is just another performance, another way of avoiding the plain, sober look this moment requires. The cost has been real. Years of a slightly quieter voice than the one you were born with. Relationships built on a version of you that took real effort to maintain and real energy to keep from cracking. A loneliness that lived underneath connection instead of beside it. None of this can be undone retroactively. The years already spent are already spent. But the bill stops accumulating the moment you stop paying it the same way. And that moment, unlike the years behind you, is entirely available to you. Starting now, starting with the next room you walk into, the next truth you feel yourself about to soften. You have not been reckless with your life. You have been paying faithfully for a safety that turned out to cost more than the danger it was protecting you from. Tonight you know the total sum for the first time. That knowledge is not meant to wound you. It is meant to make the next choice, the next small moment where the machine tries to run its old program, impossible to make blindly ever again. Notice too that this reckoning is not the same as blame, aimed either outward at whoever taught you the machine's original logic or inward at yourself for running it so faithfully for so long. Blame keeps you standing exactly where you are, arguing with the past as though the argument itself might change the total. What you need instead is closer to what an accountant does with an old debt that can no longer be collected. Not forgiveness in the soft, sentimental sense, just an honest closing of the ledger, so a new one can open with different terms. Chapter 6. Every attempt that almost worked. Why the old attempts never held. You have tried before. This is not your first time standing at this particular door. There was a January, at least one, maybe more than one if you are honest with the count, when you decided this year would be different. You wrote it down somewhere, a note in your phone, a line in a journal you bought specifically for the occasion, its pages still mostly blank by March. You meant it. That is the part worth remembering clearly, because the story you have told yourself since is that you did not mean it enough, that your resolve was somehow thinner than other people's, and that story is not just unkind. It is inaccurate. You did not fail because you lacked willpower. You failed because willpower was never the right tool for the job you were asking it to do. The same way a hammer is a perfectly good tool that will never once succeed at loosening a screw. You aimed a strength you actually have, real, considerable strength, at a mechanism that does not respond to strength at all. It responds to something slower, and you did not know that yet because no one had ever shown you the difference. Here is what actually happened in each of those attempts, laid out plainly. You identified the behavior, the appeasing, the softening, the disappearing act you perform in rooms where the temperature drops, and you decided with real conviction to simply stop doing it. For a week, maybe two, it worked. You said the harder true thing instead of the easier soft one. You felt, for those first days, something close to pride, a sense that the old pattern had finally been outmatched. And then, without any single dramatic moment you could point to afterward, the old pattern returned, quietly, almost apologetically, and you found yourself back in the exact posture you had sworn off, wondering what had gone wrong, assuming the answer was you. The answer was never you. The answer is that willpower operates from the same part of you that gets tired, that gets hungry, that gets depleted by a hard day at work
or a difficult conversation, or simple lack of sleep. And the machine you are trying to override does not get tired at all. It runs underneath conscious effort, in the same layer that controls your heartbeat and your blink reflex. And a resource that depletes will always, eventually, lose to a resource that does not. This is not a character flaw. It is a mismatch of forces, and no one told you the forces were mismatched, so you kept assuming the loss was about you rather than about the strategy. There is a distinction worth placing here carefully, because it will change how you approach everything from this point forward. Discipline is willpower applied against resistance, and it is powered by will alone, which means it is only ever as strong as your will happens to be on any given day. Fidelity is different. Fidelity is not a force you apply against something. It is closer to a loyalty so settled into your identity that it no longer requires effort to maintain, the way a person faithful to their own values does not white-knuckle their way past every temptation to betray them. They have simply become someone those temptations do not fully reach anymore. Every attempt you have made so far has been an attempt at discipline. What actually changes a pattern this deep is fidelity. And fidelity is not built through a single act of resolve. It is built the way trust is built between two people, slowly through hundreds of small, unremarkable moments that accumulate into something solid enough to hold weight. This reframes the failures you have been quietly cataloging as evidence against yourself. Each January resolution, each promise made in the aftermath of a bad fight, each version of you that decided today would be the day everything changed, was not a failure of character. It was an attempt using the wrong instrument, aimed correctly but built from the wrong material, like trying to build a house that needs to withstand years of weather out of materials only ever tested to survive a single afternoon. Notice something else about those attempts, something that will feel uncomfortable to admit. Most of them began in a moment of pain, a fight that went badly, a humiliation that stung enough to demand a response. This matters more than it seems to, because a resolution born from pain carries the pain's timeline inside it. Pain is by its nature temporary, however sharp it feels in the moment. And a resolution that depends on the pain staying sharp to keep it fueled will fade exactly as fast as the pain does. This is why the change always seemed to last precisely as long as the memory of the fight stayed vivid, and dissolved the moment ordinary life resumed, and the sting faded into something more bearable. You were not weak for letting it fade. Pain fading is simply what pain does. The mistake was building something meant to last on a foundation designed to be temporary. There is an old teaching that speaks of a garden tended, not once in a burst of fervor, but continuously, through every season, by hands that return to it whether or not the flowers are currently in bloom. That distinction between the gardener who shows up once after a storm to repair the damage and the one who shows up every day, regardless of weather, is close to the difference between what you have attempted before and what this journey is asking of you now. You have been the gardener who arrives after the storm, urgent and well-intentioned, and then disappears once the visible damage is repaired. What you are being asked to become is the other kind, the one whose presence in the garden has nothing to do with whether today happens to be a day of crisis. This is not a heavier task than what you attempted before. It is, in a strange way, lighter, because it does not require the same explosive burst of resolve that exhausted you every previous time. It asks for something smaller and steadier instead, a return, again and again, on ordinary days, when nothing in particular has gone wrong, when there is no fight fueling the fire, when the only reason to choose differently is that you have quietly decided you want to be someone who does. There is a particular cruelty in how each of those failed attempts got filed away in memory, not as evidence about a mismatched strategy, but as evidence about you personally, another entry in a long private ledger of proof that you are simply someone who does not follow through. That ledger is inaccurate, but inaccurate ledgers still feel true when you have been keeping them long enough.
and unwinding that feeling matters as much as understanding the mechanism itself. The story you tell about your own past attempts shapes how much risk you are willing to take on the next one, and a story built entirely on personal failure will always make the next attempt feel smaller and more hesitant than it needs to be. You are not starting over tonight. You are starting differently. The attempts that came before were not wasted, even though they did not hold. They taught you, at real cost, exactly which tool does not work, which is its own kind of progress, however invisible it felt at the time. The next attempt does not need to be louder or more determined than the last one. It needs to be smaller, quieter, and willing to return tomorrow whether or not tonight goes well. Chapter 7. The first thing that actually worked. The one moment that actually worked. Not the resolution. Not the promise. The small, almost accidental moment that held. Somewhere in the middle of all those failed Januaries, there was one moment that did not follow the pattern. You may not have marked it as significant at the time, because it did not arrive with fanfare, no dramatic decision, no journal entry underlined twice. It happened almost by accident, in a room where you were too tired or too caught off guard to run the usual program, and something different came out of you instead. This chapter is going to ask you to find that moment, because it is more important than every failed attempt combined. Think back. Not to the times you tried and the trying eventually gave out. To the one time, or the handful of times, when the softer, easier appeasing response simply did not arrive, and in its place, without your permission or planning, something truer came out instead, and the room did not end. The friend who did not vanish when you finally said the honest thing. The moment you canceled a plan you did not want to keep and felt, instead of the catastrophe you had braced for, a small, unfamiliar lightness. These moments are easy to dismiss, because they felt too small to count as change. But smallness is not the same as insignificance. A single seed is small too. Here is why this particular kind of moment matters more than any grand resolution ever could. A resolution is a promise made about the future, and the future, being imaginary, will believe anything you tell it. A moment that actually happened is different. It is evidence, the kind your nervous system, skeptical and battle-tested by years of the machine's warnings, cannot simply argue away, because it is not a hypothesis anymore. It already occurred. You already survived it. The fear that has run the machine for years has always operated on a prediction. That honesty will cost you the relationship. That disagreement will cost you the love. A moment like this one is the first piece of direct, lived counter-evidence against that prediction, and counter-evidence, even a single instance of it, is worth more to the process of change than 1,000 well-intentioned promises. Notice what made that moment different from the failed attempts. It is likely, though you may not have realized it at the time, that this moment did not begin with a decision at all. It began with exhaustion, or distraction, or some circumstance that simply left you without the usual bandwidth to run the appeasing program the way you normally would. The truth did not come out because you willed it bravely into the room. It came out because, for once, the machine did not have the resources to intercept it before it arrived. This detail matters enormously, because it tells you something about how change actually enters a life, not always through force, sometimes through a crack, a moment where the old defenses were simply too tired to do their usual work, and something real slipped through before it could be stopped. This does not mean the path forward is to wait passively for exhaustion to open more cracks, but it does mean something important about the nature of the work ahead. You are not trying to overpower the machine through sheer will, the way every failed January attempted. You are trying to widen the cracks that already exist, on purpose, gently. The way water widens a crack in stone, not through force, but through patient, repeated presence. There is an old teaching that says work is love made visible, and that if you cannot work with love, it is better to sit at the gate and beg from those who work with joy. It is easy to hear that and think only of vocation, of career, of the hours spent at a desk or a trade. But it applies with equal weight to the quiet inner labor of becoming someone new. The moments that actually change you are never the ones performed grudgingly, gritted teeth, forcing the right words out because you know you should. They are the moments, however small, that arrive with something closer to relief than effort. A truth that wanted to be said, finally finding an opening wide enough to leave through. That relief is the signature of real movement. Effortful, teeth-gritted honesty can be useful too, but it rarely lasts, because it is still, underneath, the discipline model. The one you already learned does not hold. Here is the practical shift this chapter is asking you to make. Stop trying to manufacture a single enormous act of courage that will prove, once and for all, that you have changed. That kind of proof does not exist, and searching for it will only exhaust you the way every previous January exhausted you. Instead, go looking for the cracks, the moments when you are tired or distracted, or simply too depleted to perform the usual appeasement, and notice what tries to come through in those moments. Do not force it, just notice it. And when it arrives, let it stay in the room a moment longer than usual before the old instinct rushes in to soften it. You already have proof that this works. It happened once, maybe more than once, in a moment you may have almost forgotten, because it did not look like the victory you had been trained to expect. It looked ordinary. It looked like nothing. But it was not nothing. It was the first real crack in a wall you had started to believe was permanent. And a wall with one real crack in it is no longer the same wall it was before, whether or not the crack is visible yet from the outside. Go back to that moment now, in your memory, and sit inside it a little longer than you have allowed yourself to before. Notice what your body felt in the seconds after the truth left your mouth and the room did not collapse. That feeling, whatever word you want to give it, relief, lightness, a strange kind of pride you did not expect, is the actual target of everything ahead. Not the absence of fear, just that feeling found once, and now worth learning how to find again. There is a distinction worth drawing between courage that is manufactured and courage that is discovered, because they are not the same thing even though they can look identical from the outside. Manufactured courage is summoned on command, forced into being through gritted resolve, and it tends to buckle under real pressure, because it was never tested against anything real to begin with. Discovered courage is different. It is not built in advance. It is found, in the moment it turns out to already be there, revealed rather than constructed. The way you discover a muscle exists by noticing it already did the lifting before you consciously decided to use it. The moment you are holding on to now, the crack that let something true slip through, was discovered courage. You did not build it in advance. You found out, in the middle of an ordinary, unremarkable moment, that it had been there all along, waiting for the defenses to be too tired to keep it hidden. That feeling did not require you to become a different person overnight. It only required a crack, a moment of depletion where the old machine could not keep up, and a willingness, once the truth had already escaped, not to chase it back inside. You do not need a bigger crack next time. You only need to notice the one already forming and let it stay open a moment longer than you did before. Chapter 8. The Part of You That Fights Back. What rises when change becomes real? Change does not arrive uncontested. Something in you is going to resist this, and it is not your enemy. You noticed the crack. You felt what it was like when the truth stayed in the room a moment longer than usual, and nothing collapsed. That should feel like the hardest part is over, and for a day or two it might. Then, without warning, something in you pushes back, harder than you expected, and you find yourself reaching for the old softening, the old silence, the old version of you that kept everyone comfortable, with more force than you have used in weeks. This is not a setback. This is the next real stage of the work. and it deserves to be understood rather than feared. Give this resistance its due, because underestimating it is the fastest way to be blindsided by it. Whatever has kept the appeasement pattern running for decades did not build itself carelessly. It built itself under real pressure, in circumstances that once carried real danger. And something built under that kind of pressure does not step aside politely just because you have started to understand it intellectually. It fights. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because, from its own distorted vantage point, frozen in the years it was formed, it believes it is protecting you from something catastrophic, and it will use everything at its disposal to keep you from what it perceives as danger. Notice the specific forms this resistance takes, because they rarely announce themselves honestly. Sometimes it arrives as sudden, urgent doubt about the whole endeavor, a voice that sounds reasonable, even wise, telling you that this is too much change too fast, that you are being reckless with relationships that matter, that the old way, at whatever its costs, at least kept things stable. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, a tiredness so specific and so perfectly timed that it seems to appear right before the moments that would have required the new response, as though your own body has developed an aversion to precisely the actions that would move you forward. Sometimes it arrives as a sudden and uncharacteristic swing in the opposite direction, where instead of appeasing you become harsh, cutting, needlessly blunt with people who did not deserve the force of it. An overcorrection that leaves you feeling ashamed and eager to retreat right back into the old softness as penance. None of these are proof that the change is failing. They are proof that something old and well-defended is being asked to loosen its grip, and things that have held tightly for a long time do not release smoothly. They release in surges, tightening further just before they finally let go, the way a fist clenches hardest in the second right before it opens. There is an old teaching about a house with two guests inside it, reason and passion, and it warns that if you let the passion alone steer, it becomes a flame that burns to its own destruction. And if you let reason alone steer, it becomes a flame that fails to warm the house at all. The teaching does not suggest choosing one over the other. It suggests that both belong, and that wisdom lies in letting them balance each other, rather than letting either seize total control. This is close to the honest posture toward the resistance you are feeling now. The part of you that wants to retreat into old patterns is not the villain of this story. It is not passion run wild or fear run wild. It is a guest in the house that has occupied the largest room for a very long time, and it is understandably alarmed to find the furniture being rearranged. Here is a distinction that will help you meet this resistance without being ruled by it. There is a difference between listening to fear and obeying it. Listening means acknowledging what the fear is trying to say, taking its concern seriously enough to actually examine it, rather than dismissing it outright or drowning it out with forced positivity. Obeying means letting the fear's conclusion become your decision without examination, simply because the fear was loud enough to override everything else. You can listen to the voice that says, "This feels dangerous," without automatically retreating to the old behavior it is recommending. In fact, listening carefully to that voice, really hearing what specifically it is afraid of, often reveals that its actual fear, at bottom, is smaller and more specific than the sweeping retreat it is demanding. It might simply be afraid of one particular person's disappointment in one particular conversation. And once you can see the fear that precisely, it becomes something you can address directly, instead of something vast enough to justify abandoning the whole effort. Notice, too, that the intensity of the resistance is not a random variable. It correlates almost exactly with how close you are getting to something that actually matters. A pattern this old does not spend its full strength defending territory it does not care about. If the resistance you are feeling right now is fierce, that fierceness is, in its own backward way, a kind of confirmation. You are not straying from the path by encountering this. You are, for perhaps the first time, walking directly into the part of the work that was always going to require the most from you. The mistake most people make here is treating the resistance as evidence that they were wrong to attempt the change at all, and retreating fully back into the old pattern, relieved, telling themselves they gave it a real shot, and it simply was not who they are. This is the moment where more attempts than you probably realize have quietly died, not from a single dramatic failure, but from a person mistaking the resistance for a verdict rather than what it actually is, which is a stage, a difficult, uncomfortable, entirely expected stage, no more permanent than the resistance a muscle feels in the first weeks of exercising a strength it has never been asked to use before. Notice, too, where this resistance actually lives, because it rarely stays only in the mind. It shows up first in the body, a specific heat behind the sternum, a tightening at the base of the throat, sometimes a restlessness in the hands that makes you want to reach for a phone, a snack, anything that offers the illusion of doing something other than simply sitting with the discomfort. This physical signature matters because it means the resistance can be met with the body as much as with argument. A slow breath held a moment longer than usual, a hand placed flat and still against a table, a few seconds of simply staying in the room with the sensation rather than fleeing it through distraction. These small physical acts do more to loosen the grip of resistance than any amount of reasoning with it ever could, because the resistance did not arrive through reasoning in the first place. It arrived through the body, and the body is often where it has to be met. You do not need to defeat this part of you tonight. You do not need to silence it or shame it into submission. You only need to recognize it clearly enough, the next time it rises, to know what you are looking at, not an enemy, not proof of failure, just an old guest, frightened by the rearranged furniture, doing exactly what it has always done to keep the house feeling familiar. You can sit with it, acknowledge its fear, and still, gently, keep moving the furniture anyway. Chapter 9. The Nights When Nothing Helps. Choosing, even when there is nothing left to choose with. This is not a chapter about your best days. This is a chapter about the ordinary Tuesday when everything in you wants to quit. There will be a day, and it may already be close, when none of what you have learned so far feels like it applies. You will be tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Something will have gone wrong that has nothing to do with any of this work. A bad day at a job that drains you, a headache that will not lift, a piece of news that knocked something loose in you hours before the moment that actually tests you arrives. And in that depleted state, the old pattern will not simply tempt you. It will feel, in that specific moment, like the only reasonable option left, the only thing your remaining energy can afford. This chapter exists because almost everything written about change assumes a version of you with enough energy to apply it. The books, the teachings, the resolutions, they are all written implicitly for the version of you sitting calm and rested, willing and able to choose wisely. But real life does not consult that version of you before it hands you the moments that matter most. It hands them to you exhausted, at the end of a day that has already taken everything you had, and asks you to choose anyway. Here is the honest truth about what happens in those moments. The truth no one tells you in advance, because it is not encouraging enough to put on a poster. When you are depleted, the machine wins more easily. Not because you have failed at anything, and not because the work you have done so far was somehow undone. Simply because the machine, the old appeasing pattern, runs on almost no fuel. It is efficient by design, built during years when your resources were scarce, and it needed to function reliably even then. The new response, the truer, steadier one you have been slowly building, is newer and newer things, like new muscle, require more energy to activate than old, well-worn grooves. On a night when you have almost nothing left, the path of least resistance will, more often than not, be the old path, because it is, quite literally, the path that costs less. This is not the failure it will feel like in the moment. It is physics. And understanding it as physics, rather than character, is the single most useful thing this chapter can give you.
Because the alternative, believing that slipping back into old patterns on your worst nights is proof the whole effort was a lie, is exactly the kind of thinking that has ended every previous attempt you have made. There is an old teaching about a people who ask a prophet to speak of pain, and he tells them that much of their pain is self-chosen, that it is the breaking of the shell that encloses their understanding, and that they should let their tears and their blood run their course through their heart without complaint, the way the seasons come and go without their permission. It does not promise that pain will be avoided. It promises only that pain, met honestly, has its own purpose, even when it feels, in the moment, like pure loss. Your depleted nights are a version of this. They are not detours from the path. They are, uncomfortably, part of it, the seasons of scarcity that any real growth has to pass through, whether or not you feel ready. Here is the practical wisdom this chapter offers, and it is smaller and more forgiving than anything you have tried before. On the nights when you have nothing left, do not attempt the hardest version of the new response. Attempting the hardest version when you are at your weakest is how people convince themselves the whole project has failed, because they set themselves up to fail at the worst possible moment, and then generalize that single failure into a verdict on everything. Instead, on those nights, aim for something almost embarrassingly small. Not the full truth, spoken clearly and without flinching. Just slightly less untrue than what the old pattern would have said. Not a boundary held perfectly. Just held a little longer than it would have been 6 months ago. This is not lowering your standards. This is understanding that a fortress built over decades is not torn down in a single night, especially not a night when you have nothing left to tear it down with, and that the goal on a depleted night is not victory. It is simply not losing more ground than you have to. Notice, too, what these low-energy nights reveal that your best days never could. They show you, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly how deep the old pattern still runs, which parts of the new response have actually become instinct, and which parts are still entirely dependent on conscious effort. You do not have tonight. This information is valuable precisely because it is unflattering. It tells you where the real work still needs to go. Information your good days, when everything feels easier than it actually is, would never have given you. There is a specific kind of grace required here, and it is not the soft, permissive grace of telling yourself none of it matters. It is a harder grace, the kind that says the setback is real, the old pattern did win tonight, and that fact changes nothing about tomorrow. The machine does not get to claim a single depleted night as proof of anything permanent. It only gets to claim the night itself, and even that claim expires the moment the sun comes up and you are, once again, standing at the same door, a little more rested, a little more able to choose. You will have nights like this, possibly soon. When they come, do not measure yourself against your best moments. Measure yourself only against what was actually possible in the exhausted, depleted state you were actually in. And if you managed even a fraction less appeasement than the old pattern would have demanded, count that as what it actually is. Not failure, not full success either. Just a Tuesday survived, with the fortress still standing but one stone looser than it was the day before. There is a distinction worth making here between depletion and rest, because they are often confused, and the confusion costs people more ground than the depletion itself. Rest replenishes. It is chosen, or at least received willingly, and it leaves you with more capacity afterward than you had before it. Depletion is different. It is not chosen. It is simply what remains after a day has taken more than it gave back. And no amount of telling yourself to push through will turn depletion into rest by force of will alone. On the nights this chapter is describing, the wisest move is sometimes not to test yourself against the old pattern at all, but to recognize depletion honestly enough to remove yourself from the situations most likely to demand a response you do not currently have the resources to give. This is not avoidance. It is the same practical wisdom that keeps an exhausted person from driving, applied to a different kind of exhaustion. There is no version of this work that skips these nights entirely. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a version of change that has never actually been tested against a real, exhausted, ordinary life. The nights when nothing helps are not the exception to the process. They are, in their own quiet way, proof that the process is real enough to be tested by something as unglamorous as a bad Tuesday, and still standing the next morning. Chapter 10. The People Who Knew the Old You. What changes when you do? You are changing. They did not sign up for that. This is where it gets complicated, something you have not yet had to face directly, because the work so far has mostly happened inside you, alone, in kitchens at midnight and quiet moments of recognition, is about to become unavoidable. The people around you, the ones who have known you for years, built entire relationships with a version of you that ran on the old machine. And that version served a function for them, whether they ever admitted it to themselves or not. As you begin to change, even in small, halting ways, you will discover that not everyone is glad to see it, and the reasons for that are more complicated and less personal than they will feel in the moment. Consider the shape of every relationship you have built while the old pattern was running. Somewhere in each of them, whether the other person is consciously aware of it or not, an equilibrium was reached, a set of unspoken rules about who yields and who does not, who absorbs discomfort and who is permitted to express it freely. You have likely been, in most of your close relationships, the one who yields, not because anyone forced this role on you deliberately, but because your machine made you extremely good at it, and people, quite naturally, arrange themselves around whatever makes a relationship run smoothly. If you have always softened first, others have never needed to learn how to soften at all. If you have always absorbed the friction, others have never had to develop tolerance for friction of their own. This means that when you begin to change, even gently, even with real care for the people involved, you are not simply adjusting your own behavior in isolation. You are disturbing an equilibrium that other people, often without knowing it, have come to depend on. And people, when an equilibrium they depend on shifts, do not usually respond with immediate understanding, even when they love you. Even when the change is one you know deep down, they would say they want for you if asked directly. They respond first with the discomfort of an old system no longer working the way it used to. You will feel this most sharply with the people closest to you. A partner who has never had to sit with your disappointment, because you have always managed it for them before it could fully surface, may suddenly find themselves facing a version of you willing to let the disappointment exist in the room, unmanaged, and their first response may not be gratitude for your honesty. It may be confusion, or even irritation, a sense that you have somehow become harder to be around, when what has actually happened is that you have simply stopped doing invisible labor they never knew was being performed on their behalf. There is an old teaching that speaks of the space in togetherness, and says that even as the strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music, two people who love each other should let there be spaces in their togetherness, and stand together yet not too near. It goes on to say that the oak tree and the cypress do not grow in each other's shadow. This is worth holding on to here, because what you are being asked to build is not distance for its own sake, but a kind of space that has been missing, a space where each person in a relationship can hold their own weight, instead of one person quietly carrying both. Here is the distinction that matters most in this part of the work. Not everyone who resists your change is opposed to your well-being. Most of them are simply reacting, honestly and understandably, to the disruption of a pattern that made their life easier, without any awareness that the ease came at your expense. This is not the same as malice. A person can benefit from your appeasement without ever having asked you to appease them. The way a person standing downstream benefits from a dam they did not build and may not even know exists. When the dam changes, they feel the change in the water level, and their first response is rarely to ask what the dam needed. It is to notice, with some alarm, that the water is behaving differently than it used to. This means you will need to hold two things at once,
which is uncomfortable but necessary. You can extend real compassion to the people whose discomfort is honest and not aimed at controlling you, understanding that adjustment takes time for them just as it has taken time for you.
And you can, at the very same time, refuse to let their discomfort become the deciding vote on whether you continue. These two things are not in conflict, though they will feel like it in the heat of an actual conversation. Compassion does not require compliance. You can understand exactly why someone is unsettled by your change, and still choose not to reverse it simply because their unsettling is inconvenient for them. There is a smaller, harder truth hiding inside this chapter that deserves to be said plainly rather than softened, in keeping with everything this work has been asking of you. Some relationships were built almost entirely on the equilibrium you are now disrupting, and those relationships may not survive the change intact. This is not a threat, and it is not inevitable for every relationship in your life. Most people who genuinely love you will, given enough time and enough patience from you, adjust to a version of you that takes up a little more room, expresses a little more honestly, requires a little more from them in return. But a few relationships were built on precisely the imbalance you are dismantling. And dismantling the imbalance may reveal that there was less holding the relationship together than either of you wanted to believe. This is a real loss, if it happens, and it deserves to be grieved rather than minimized. But it is not evidence that the change was a mistake. It is evidence that the change was real enough to matter. Picture the specific shape this adjustment takes with someone who genuinely loves you and simply needs time to catch up. The first weeks may be the hardest, small frictions appearing in places that used to run smoothly, a slight surprise in their voice when you decline something you would once have accepted without hesitation. This is not the relationship breaking. This is the relationship recalibrating, the way an old scale recalibrates when a familiar weight is finally removed from one side of it. Given enough patience from both people, most relationships find a new equilibrium that is not only stable, but genuinely more honest than the one it replaced, because it no longer depends on one person quietly absorbing what the other never had to learn to carry. You are not responsible for managing everyone else's adjustment to the truer version of you. You are responsible for offering that version with as much patience and clarity as you can manage, and then allowing the people in your life to meet it honestly, in their own time, at their own pace. Some will surprise you with how quickly they welcome it. Others will take longer than you would like. A few may not make the journey with you at all. All three outcomes are survivable, and none of them are proof that you should have stayed smaller to keep the water level exactly where it used to be. Chapter 11. Where the Machine Was Built. Understanding where it began without blame, not to assign blame. To finally understand the ground you were standing on when all of this began. There is a room somewhere in your memory, or a version of a room, that you have visited before, if not literally, then in the shape of 100 smaller memories that all point back toward the same source. This chapter is going to ask you to walk into that room one more time, not to relive it, and not to place blame at anyone's feet, but to finally see clearly the exact conditions under which the machine you have spent 10 chapters examining was first assembled. You did not invent the belief that love must be earned. No child invents that belief from nothing. It is taught almost always without any deliberate intention to teach it, through the accumulated pattern of 1,000 small moments, a parent's attention that came and went in ways you could never predict. A household where calm was conditional, and its conditions were never quite spoken aloud, only felt, the way a room's temperature is felt before it is named. You learn to read that temperature with extraordinary precision, because your safety, in a very real sense, depended on the accuracy of the reading. This was not a flaw in you. It was one of the most sophisticated skills a young mind can develop, an early warning system built to protect you inside a world that did not offer warnings any other way. Here is what almost no one tells you about roots this old. They are rarely built by a single dramatic event.
It is tempting to search your history for one clear moment, a single incident large enough to explain everything, because a single incident is easier to make sense of than a slow accumulated weather system. But most patterns this deep are built the way sediment is built, layer upon layer, each one thin enough to be unremarkable on its own, until decades later the layers together form something as solid and load-bearing as stone. If you go looking for the one moment that explains everything and cannot find it, that does not mean the root does not exist. It means the root was built the way most roots are built, slowly, out of the ordinary weather of an entire childhood, rather than any single storm. There is an old teaching that speaks of children as arrows sent forth from a bow, and says the parents are the bow from which their children as living arrows are sent forth, and that the archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and bends the bow with great might so that the arrows may go swift and far. It says, too, that the bow does not resent the arrow's flight, and that the archer loves both the arrow that flies and the bow that remains stable in the archer's hand. This image is worth sitting with, because it refuses the two easy stories most people tell about their own history. It does not ask you to see your caregivers as villains who deliberately shaped you into someone smaller than you were meant to be. But it also does not ask you to pretend the bending did not happen, or that it left no mark on the shape of the arrow. Both things can be true. The people who shaped you were, in all likelihood, doing the best they knew how to do with the tools they had, tools that were, in turn, given to them by their own bow, their own archer, stretching back further than you will ever be able to fully trace. This is not an argument for excusing harm, and it is not an argument for erasing your own experience in service of understanding someone else's. It is an argument for a more accurate map, because an inaccurate map, one built entirely on blame or entirely on excuse, will always eventually lead you back to the same place you started. The people who taught you, however unintentionally, that love was conditional, were very likely taught the same lesson themselves, by their own version of an unpredictable room, and somewhere further back than that, someone else learned it too, in a chain stretching back further than any single person could be reasonably asked to answer for. Notice what shifts in your body when you consider the pattern this way, as something inherited rather than something inflicted specifically at you. There is a difference between the wound of being harmed on purpose and the wound of being shaped, unintentionally, by someone who was themselves still bent from an earlier bending. Both wounds are real. Both deserve to be taken seriously. But they call for different responses. The first calls for boundaries, sometimes distance, sometimes an anger that needs real space to exist before it can soften into anything else. The second calls for something closer to what you might feel looking at an old photograph of someone you love, standing in circumstances they did not choose, doing the best they could with an understanding that was, at the time, genuinely the most they had access to. You are allowed to hold grief for the child who learned this lesson too young, without needing that grief to resolve into either forgiveness or blame before you are ready for either. Grief does not require a verdict. It only requires acknowledgement, an honest look at what was lost, what was learned too early, what shaped you before you had any say in the matter. Here is the part that actually changes something, more than any amount of understanding the past ever could on its own. The root explains why the machine was built. It does not obligate you to keep living inside the structure that root produced. A tree does not choose the soil it first takes root in, and yet a tree can, over decades, given enough light and enough time, grow in directions that soil never predicted, sending branches toward openings the original roots never anticipated existed. You are not required to stay the exact shape that early soil determined. You are only required to understand honestly what that soil was, so that the growth you choose from here forward is chosen with open eyes, rather than repeated blindly simply because it is the only shape you have ever known. Tonight, you understand something about the ground you started from that you did not fully understand before. That understanding will not undo a single year of the pattern it produced, but it changes the nature of the work ahead, transforming it from a battle against some flaw in your own character into something closer to what it actually is. A slow, deliberate redirection of growth toward light the original soil never offered, made possible by roots that, however imperfectly formed, are still, after everything, capable of reaching somewhere new. You do not owe the past a resolution before you are allowed to move forward from it. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness, if it comes at all, comes in its own time, on its own terms, and never as a requirement for healing to continue. What you owe yourself, more urgently than any resolution with the past, is simply the freedom to keep growing toward light your original soil never knew to offer. Chapter 12. The Vanishing. Why progress disappears, and how to bring it back. You were doing so well, and then without any clear reason, you were not. There will come a stretch of weeks, maybe already has, when the progress you fought so hard to build simply seems to disappear. Not dramatically. Not in one identifiable collapse you could point to and explain. It fades the way morning fog fades, so gradually that you cannot mark the exact moment it was still there and the moment it was gone. And one day you notice, with a kind of quiet dread, that you have slipped almost entirely back into the old pattern, the appeasing, the softening, the disappearing act, without any single decision to do so. This chapter exists because this vanishing is not a sign that the work failed. It is one of the most predictable and least discussed parts of any real change, and understanding why it happens is often the difference between a temporary regression and a permanent one. Here is the mechanism behind the fade, laid out honestly. Change that happens through conscious, deliberate effort requires structure to hold it in place. The same way a young tree, however strong its roots may eventually become, requires a stake and a tie for its first several seasons, not because the tree is weak, but because new growth has not yet developed the density to stand entirely on its own against real wind. Most people, once they feel the first real success of a change, quietly remove the structure that made the success possible, not out of carelessness, but out of a very natural, very human assumption that success means the support is no longer needed. This assumption is almost always premature, and it is the single most common reason progress that felt solid a month ago seems to have evaporated with no clear cause. Think honestly about what structure you built, even informally, during the weeks when the change felt most alive. Perhaps you were journaling every evening, noticing the machine's attempts in real time. Perhaps you had a friend you were checking in with, someone who knew what you were working on and could reflect it back to you when you could not see it yourself. Perhaps you were simply paying closer attention than usual, in a general sense, because the whole project still felt new and worth watching closely. And then gradually, as the change started to feel less like an active project, and more like simply how things were now, that attention relaxed. The journaling became occasional, then stopped. The check-ins became less frequent, then quietly ended. None of this happened through a single decision to abandon the work. It happened through the ordinary erosion of vigilance that follows any success, the same erosion that causes a person who has finally paid off a debt to slowly, without ever deciding to, start accumulating a new one. There is an old teaching about houses, and about the wisdom of building them well, not simply for shelter from wind and rain, but as a dwelling worthy of the dreams within it. It observes that in the wisdom of building, the roof is placed only after the walls are secure. This ordering matters. A structure built to hold real weight is built in stages, each one securing the one before it, and a person who declares the house finished the moment the walls stand upright, before the roof has been placed to protect what is inside, should not be surprised when the first real rain reveals how much was still exposed. Here is the distinction that will help you understand what has actually happened during this vanishing, rather than experiencing it purely as failure. There is a difference between a value that has been fully internalized and a value that is still being maintained through active attention. A fully internalized change requires no ongoing structure, because it has become identity. The way a person who has genuinely become honest no longer has to remind themselves not to lie. The lying has simply stopped being an option their character considers. But internalization takes far longer than the initial burst of progress suggests, often years rather than months, and the gap between when a change first feels solid and when it actually becomes identity is exactly the gap where this vanishing tends to occur. You mistook an early, structure-dependent success for a finished transformation, and the structure, quietly removed, took the visible progress down with it when it went. This is not evidence that you were never really changing. It is evidence that you were changing exactly as slowly and as normally as change actually happens, and that the appearance of a finished transformation a few weeks or months in was always somewhat premature, a hopeful illusion rather than an accurate read of where you actually stood. The practical response to this vanishing is neither despair nor a dramatic new resolution, both of which have already proven, across your history with this work, to burn out quickly. The response is simpler and less exciting than either of those options. Rebuild the structure, not a bigger one, not a more ambitious one, designed to prove this time will be different through sheer intensity. The same modest structure that supported the progress the first time, resumed without shame, without treating its necessity as evidence of some personal failing. The tree that leans on its stake again after a hard wind knocked it sideways is not failing to grow. It is simply still growing, and still, for now, in need of support it will not always require. Notice, too, that each time you rebuild the structure after a vanishing like this one, the rebuilding tends to take less than it did before. This is easy to miss because you are focused on the frustration of having to rebuild it all, but it is worth tracking deliberately, because it is real evidence of progress that the vanishing itself obscures. The first time you lost the thread, it may have taken months to find your way back. If this is the second or third vanishing, notice how much faster the return has been. That acceleration, quiet and easy to overlook, is the actual shape real change takes over time, not a straight line upward, a spiral circling back through familiar territory, again and again, each pass a little higher than the one before, even when, from inside any single loop, it feels like you have returned to exactly where you started. There is a distinction worth naming between forgetting that erases and forgetting that simply loosens its grip on attention. When a skill becomes truly automatic, driving a familiar road, typing on a keyboard, the forgetting that follows is not loss. It is graduation, the mind freeing up space because the skill no longer needs conscious supervision. But there is another kind of forgetting, the kind that happens here, where the underlying pattern was never actually finished integrating, and the relaxed attention removed real support before the structure was ready to stand without it. Learning to tell these two kinds of forgetting apart, asking honestly which one is happening before assuming the worse, is its own useful skill, one that will save you from mistaking premature relaxation for genuine mastery more than once in the years ahead. You have not lost the progress you built. You have lost the structure that was holding it visible, and the progress itself, quieter now, less obvious, is still there underneath, waiting for the support that will let it show itself again. Build the support back, not out of shame for having let it go, simply because that is what building requires, again and again, until the day the walls no longer need the scaffolding that raised them. Chapter 13. Who you are becoming without noticing. Becoming, one ordinary moment at a time. At some point, this stops being something you do. It becomes something you are. You are closer to that point than you think. There is a particular kind of mourning worth paying attention to, one that will likely have already happened by the time you read this, or will happen soon, almost without ceremony. You will find yourself in a moment that would once have triggered the entire machine, the temperature drop, the urge to soften, the old familiar tightening in your chest. And you will notice, almost as an afterthought, that the response simply did not arrive. Not because you fought it off, not because you remembered a lesson from an earlier chapter and applied it deliberately. It will not happen at all. The way a habit you have genuinely outgrown does not require refusal, because there is nothing left in you reaching for it in the first place. This chapter is about that moment, and about the strange, quiet way identity actually changes, which is almost never the way you expect it to. Here is something worth understanding clearly, because it reframes everything that has come before it. Every technique in this work so far, noticing the pattern, widening the gap between trigger and response, rebuilding the structure after a vanishing, all of it has been aimed at a single, larger target that none of the individual techniques could reach on their own. The target was never simply better behavior in isolated moments. The target was a shift in who you understand yourself to be, at the level beneath conscious thought, the level where you do not decide to be honest so much as discover, in the moment honesty is called for, that you already are. This distinction matters enormously, because it explains why the earlier chapters felt effortful in a way that this stage does not. Behavior change driven by conscious effort is expensive, drawing on a limited daily reserve of willpower that depletes with every use, which is why the depleted nights in an earlier chapter cost you so much ground. Identity, once it has actually shifted, does not draw on that same reserve at all. A person who has become at the level of identity, someone who tells the truth, does not spend willpower deciding to tell it in any given moment. The decision has already been made once, at a level deeper than any single situation, and every subsequent moment simply expresses a conclusion that was reached long before that moment arrived. You are somewhere in the middle of this shift right now, and the middle is a strange, disorienting place to stand, because it does not feel like either the old self or the new one fully. You will catch yourself, in a single day, doing both, appeasing in one conversation entirely by old reflex, and then an hour later speaking a hard truth in another conversation with a steadiness that surprises even you, arriving without the usual internal battle. This is not inconsistency, and it is not proof that the change is unstable or somehow not real. It is exactly what an identity shift looks like from the inside while it is happening. Two selves occupying the same body during a transition that has no clean line marking where one ends and the other begins. There is an old teaching that speaks of a self deeper than the self that walks and talks and can be seen, describing it as a sea, boundless and measureless, that remains whether the fortunes of the visible self rise or fall, an ocean unmoved beneath waves that are only ever its surface. This distinction is worth holding closely here, because the old appeasing pattern, however deeply it once ran, was always a wave, not the ocean itself. It felt for years like the whole of who you were, because it was loud, persistent, and constantly active. The way a wave at the surface is the only part of the sea most people ever notice. But underneath it, the whole time, was something steadier, something that did not disappear during all those years the wave was crashing. Something this entire work has not been building from nothing, but simply uncovering layer by layer, the way you might clear debris from a spring that never actually stopped running underneath it. This reframes the entire project in a way worth sitting with. You have not been constructing a new person from raw materials. You have been excavating one who was always present, buried under years of adaptive behavior that made sense once and no longer does. This matters because construction and excavation feel entirely different, psychologically. Construction implies you were incomplete, lacking something essential that needed to be built from nothing. Excavation implies the opposite, that what you are recovering was always whole, always there, simply covered over by the necessary debris of surviving a particular set of circumstances that no longer apply. Notice the specific evidence of this excavation in your own recent life, evidence easy to overlook because it does not announce itself as significant.
A conversation where you said the true thing, and it did not feel like an act of courage. It simply felt like the obvious thing to say. A boundary held not through gritted teeth, but through a calm so complete you almost forgot afterward that holding it had once required any effort at all. These moments are not smaller versions of the identity shift. They are the identity shift, happening in real time, in a form so quiet it can pass entirely unnoticed if you are still measuring change by the standard of the earlier, more dramatic chapters. Here is the final important piece of this stage of the work. You do not get to declare the identity shift complete, the way you might announce the end of a project. It does not work that way, and trying to force a declaration of completion will only set you up to feel that you have failed each time an old pattern briefly resurfaces, as it likely still will, occasionally, for longer than you might expect. Identity shifts the way a coastline shifts, through the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary tides, each one unremarkable on its own, until one day, without a single dramatic before and after, the shape of the land is simply undeniably different than it used to be. You are, right now, closer to that different shape than you realize, not because of any single chapter of this work, and not because of any single act of will, because of hundreds of small moments, most of them already forgotten, where the ocean underneath the old waves quietly, patiently, made itself a little more visible than it was the day before. You will know this shift is further along than you think the next time someone who knew the old version of you remarks, almost in passing, that you seem different lately, calmer, harder to rattle. You will not have a dramatic story to explain it. You will only have the accumulated evidence of an ocean that was always there, finally settled enough on the surface for someone else to notice it too. Chapter 14. The whole of it. Finally in one place. Everything, finally, seen as one whole. Nothing new happens in this chapter. Everything that already happened finally sits down together. There is a particular quiet that arrives near the end of a long piece of work, different from the quiet of the beginning. The quiet at the start was the quiet of not yet knowing, the stillness before a storm you could sense but not yet name. This quiet is different. It is the quiet of a house after a long renovation, tools finally put away, dust finally settled, a space that has been disrupted for so long that its current stillness feels almost unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as though you are waiting for the next wall to come down. It will not. This chapter is where you finally stand in the middle of what you have built and see it for the first time as a single structure, rather than a series of separate repairs. Walk back through it now, not to relearn any of it, but to see how each piece was never actually separate from the others, however disconnected they may have felt while you were living through them one at a time. You started by noticing the coat you had never taken off, the accumulated weight of a life built around a self that had quietly stopped fitting. That noticing meant nothing on its own. It only became useful once you were willing to name the machine underneath it. The belief that love must be earned, installed early, in circumstances that made sense at the time, and stopped making sense long before you were willing to admit it. Naming the machine meant nothing on its own either, until you understood its cost, the slow erosion of your own voice, the loneliness of being loved for a performance rather than a self. And understanding the cost meant nothing until you were honest about every attempt you had already made to change it, and why those attempts, however sincere, were built from a tool, willpower alone, that was never strong enough to hold against something built this deep. Each piece, on its own, was insufficient. Together they became something else entirely, the way a single board means nothing, and an entire frame, assembled correctly, can hold the weight of a roof. You found, somewhere in the middle of all this, the first real crack, the moment exhaustion let something true slip through before the old defenses could stop it. And you learned that change rarely enters through force, more often through the small openings that appear when the old machine simply does not have the resources to intercept what wants to come through.
You met the resistance that rose once the change became real enough to threaten the old equilibrium, and you learned to recognize it as a frightened, familiar guest rather than an enemy to be defeated. You survived the depleted nights when none of it seemed to apply, and learned that surviving those nights without losing all the ground you had gained was its own form of success, quieter and less glamorous than the version of success you had originally imagined, but real. You faced the people who knew the old version of you, and discovered that not everyone would welcome the truer version without friction, and that this friction, while painful, was not proof you had done something wrong. You walked back into the room where the machine was first built, not to assign blame, but to finally see the ground you had been standing on your entire life, ground you did not choose and could not have changed at the time, but could, finally, choose to grow away from now. You watched the progress vanish, more than once probably, and learned that the vanishing was not the end of the work, but one of its most ordinary and most survivable stages, provided you were willing to rebuild the structure that had made the progress visible in the first place. And somewhere in the last chapter, without a single dramatic moment marking the exact transition, you began to notice that some of what once required tremendous effort had simply stopped requiring effort at all, because the person doing it had, in some real and durable sense, become someone new. There is an old teaching that speaks of self-knowledge, and says that the soul unfolds itself like a lotus of countless petals, and that the vision of one man does not lend its wings to another man, though each is alone in his knowledge of himself. This is worth holding in this consolidating moment, because none of what you have built here was ever meant to make you into someone else's version of whole. It was meant to help you find the petals that were already yours, buried under a lifetime of adaptation, and to unfold them at whatever pace was actually true for you, not the pace any book, including this one, might have suggested was ideal. Notice something important about the shape of what you have built, now that you can finally see it whole. It is not a fortress, sealed and finished, immune from future weather. It is closer to a garden that has been tended long enough to establish real roots, capable now of surviving a storm that would have flattened it in its earlier, more fragile stages, but still, and always, a living thing that requires ongoing attention rather than a project that, once completed, needs nothing further from you. This is not a discouraging truth. Living things that require ongoing tending are also the only kind of things capable of continuing to grow, long after a finished, static structure would have simply begun, slowly, to decay. You are not the same person who stood in that kitchen at 11 at night, unable to name what was wrong, only certain that something was. You have not become someone unrecognizable, a stranger wearing your face. You have become more precisely, more completely, who you already were underneath the coat that no longer fit. The machine still exists somewhere in you, quieter now, less influential, occasionally still capable of a surge on a bad enough night. It probably always will exist in some form, but it no longer runs the whole house the way it once did. It is one guest among several now, no longer the one deciding, alone, who gets to speak, and who has to stay silent to keep the peace. This is what consolidation actually looks like, not the absence of the old pattern, the presence, finally, of something else standing beside it, steady enough now to no longer be overrun by it every time the temperature in a room happens to drop. None of this means every question has been answered, or every corner of the old pattern fully mapped. There are likely rooms in you this work has not yet reached, situations that have not yet arisen to test what has actually changed and what has only appeared to. That uncertainty is not a weakness in what you have built. It is simply the honest condition of anyone doing real work on themselves rather than performing a tidy story about having finished. The consolidation this chapter offers is not a final exam passed. It is a foundation, solid enough now to build further from, whatever the untested rooms turn out to require when their moment eventually comes. You do not need a final test to prove this is real. The proof has already been accumulating quietly in every ordinary moment across the last 13 chapters, where the old machine reached for control and found, for the first time in years, that something else in the house was strong enough to answer instead. Chapter 15. What the Open Hand Was For. The open loop closes. This is the only chapter that does not leave a door ajar behind it. This one closes. Go back, for a moment, to where all of this began. Not the kitchen, not the coat, not the machine, and its long history. Further back than that, to the very first image this journey gave you, before you knew anything about yourself that you know now. A hand, closed tightly around something it was afraid to lose. A question, left open on purpose, about what that hand would do once it finally opened. You have carried that question the entire way here, whether you noticed it consciously or not, and it is time finally to answer it. Here is what an open hand is for. Not nothing, which is what the closed hand always feared. Not loss, which is what the machine spent a lifetime insisting would follow the moment the grip released. An open hand is for receiving what could never actually fit inside a fist to begin with. This is the truth the fear could never see clearly, because fear, by its nature, can only measure what might be lost. It has no instrument for measuring what was never able to arrive while the hand stayed closed. Think of everything you were gripping when this journey started. A version of yourself that no longer fit. Relationships held together by a performance rather than a self. A belief, installed so early you never had the chance to question it, that love was a transaction requiring constant, exhausting proof. Each of these felt at the time like something precious you could not survive losing, which is exactly why the hand closed around them so tightly in the first place. But look now, from here, at what a hand that tight was actually capable of holding. Nothing could enter it, nothing new, nothing unexpected, nothing that required an open palm to receive. A closed fist can defend what it already has. It cannot be given anything more. There is an old teaching about love that will not be possessed, and it says, "Love gives naught but itself, and takes naught but from itself, and neither possesses nor would it be possessed, for love is sufficient unto love." For years this may have sounded like poetry too gentle to survive contact with a real life. It is not gentle, it is exact. Every closed-fisted version of love you built, every appeasement offered as a down payment against abandonment, every truth softened to keep someone from leaving, was an attempt to possess love, to hold it still, to guarantee it through control, rather than let it exist the only way it ever actually can, freely, unguaranteed, given and received rather than earned and defended. The fist was never protecting love. It was only ever preventing it. You know this now, not as an idea borrowed from somewhere else, but as something lived, in the specific texture of your own recent life. The conversation where you told the truth and the room did not end. The relationship that grew steadier, not weaker, once you stopped performing a version of yourself edited for someone else's comfort. The mornings, more frequent now than they used to be, when you wake without the low, constant hum of a grip that never fully released. None of this arrived because you fought harder than you had fought before. It arrived because, slowly, in 1,000 small moments across everything this journey asked of you, the hand opened. Here is what remains, now that the open loop has finally closed. The machine has not vanished. It will likely never fully vanish, and there is no failure in that. It was built by a child doing the best that child could with an unpredictable world, and some trace of it will probably outlive every chapter of this work, surfacing occasionally on a hard enough night, in a low enough moment, the way an old injury sometimes aches before a change in weather. This is not the mark of unfinished work. It is simply what it means to have survived something real. The scar does not undo the healing. It is evidence the healing was necessary in the first place. What has changed is not the absence of the old fear. What has changed is what the fear is allowed to decide.
It used to run the entire house, deciding who spoke and who stayed silent, what truths were safe, and which ones had to be buried to keep the peace. Now it is one voice among several, heard, acknowledged, occasionally even useful, but no longer sovereign over every room. You built this not through a single act of courage, though there were moments that required real courage, but through the slower, less dramatic work of returning again and again, on ordinary days when nothing forced you to, choosing the open hand instead of the fist, until the choosing became less like effort and more like simply who you had become. There is one more piece of the old teaching worth carrying forward from here, about a people gathered at a shore, watching a ship arrive to carry someone they loved away, and being told that a little while, a moment of rest upon the wind, and another woman shall bear him. This is not a lesson about endings, though it wears the shape of one. It is a lesson about the nature of anything that matters, that it never actually stops. It only changes form, passing from one set of hands into the next, the way what you have built here will not stop the moment this final chapter ends. It will simply continue, quietly, in every ordinary room you walk into from now on, carried not by this book, but by you. The code is off, not thrown away in some dramatic gesture, but simply, finally, no longer worn out of fear that nothing else would fit. The hand that used to close around everything it was afraid to lose now knows, with a certainty no fear can talk it out of, exactly what it was always for. Not holding, receiving, not guarding a life against loss, living one, open-palmed in the only way a life was ever actually meant to be lived. You did not need to become someone else to arrive here. You only needed to stop gripping so tightly to the self that was never quite you, long enough to let the one underneath it, the one that was always whole, finally stand in the open air it had been waiting for the entire time. Picture your own open hand now, resting quietly at your side, the way it has been the entire time you have been reading this, doing nothing dramatic, simply open. That ordinariness is the point. An open hand does not announce itself. It does not require an audience or a ceremony to prove it has changed. It simply rests, ready, capable now of receiving whatever arrives next, whether that is a hand offered back to you in return, or a task worth doing for its own sake, or nothing at all beyond the quiet, sufficient fact of no longer needing to hold on so tightly to survive the day. This is where the journey ends, not because there is nothing left to learn, but because everything left to learn from here will come from your own life now, not from these pages. The open loop that has followed you since the very first paragraph is closed. What replaces it is not an answer you were given. It is a life you are, finally, fully equipped to keep living, open-handed, for as long as you choose to. The Open Hand, a narrative based on the Prophet, by Kahlil Gibran.